everyone. Welcome once again to this session on understanding what it means for us to build trauma informed workplaces and ensure that we are able to support survivors of sexual and gender based violence at work through a reading from a book by One Future Collective that's been recently released. It's called Planting Dandelions, Supporting Survivors of Sexual and Gender Based Violence. The authors are Vibha Sridharan, Arshia Kochar, and myself, Karishma Shafi. Today, I'll be taking us through a little bit of the background of why this book came to be, why we've sort of worked on it, why we think this is a theme that's really super important. And of course, I will be reading through a bit of the book as well, and inviting any feedback, any thoughts that you have, any ideas. But yeah, with that in mind, let's jump right in. If we can go on to the next slide, please, Yash. Super. So as we do with all sessions, this is just a quick personal weather report. Tell us how you're feeling, if you're feeling good, if it's all sunny, if it's cloudy with a chance of rain, if it's partially sunny, how are you feeling today? I know it is a really interesting, fruitful day full of conversations about DEI, about building safer, inclusive workplaces, which can be a bit of a heavy topic. So do tell us how you're feeling as well. Please feel free to drop any expectations or any ideas, thoughts that you're walking into this session with. I will give this about 10 seconds and you can share in chat. Of course, feel free to keep sharing your thoughts in chat and to keep sharing if, your state of mind or your state of participation changes throughout the session as well. Superb. I will wait to hear from people in chat, how they're feeling, what their day is going like so far, and it's going to be really interesting, just in general, for me to hear from all of you as well. So please do feel free to keep sharing in chat if you have thoughts, ideas. With that in mind, let's move on, perhaps, Yash, to the next slide and set some context. Super. Yeah. So, a little bit perhaps about myself and my organization, One Future Collective. We are a feminist social purpose organization with a vision of a world built on social justice, led by communities of care. We fight for the right of each person to live a life of safety, dignity, and belongingness by catalyzing people power and building just institutions. You can learn a little bit more about us by visiting our website, www.onefuturecollective.org. If you'd like to learn about what work we do, the way we do it, etc. And that's a little bit perhaps on One Future Collective. If we can move on to the next slide, I can do a quick introduction for myself as well. Super. So my name is Karishma Shafi. Like I said, I'm one of the authors of the book that we'll be reading from today. I am also a senior program manager here at One Future Collective. I work in the Just Institutions vertical, which just means that my work centers research, advocacy, communication, strategizing, and strategy in general, working with institutions and ensuring that we are able to create environments and organizations that are just to their core and that address power in the way that they operate. That's a little bit about myself. Perhaps if we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, just a couple of norms that I'd like to set as we move into the session. I know it's quite a short one, but I still wanted to share them with you. Essentially, we hope to practice active listening in all of our work. We hope to allow space for ourselves and for others to share equitably throughout the space. We will be respectful and empathetic in all of our communications, and we will also allow ourselves some discomfort in having these conversations because they truly are uncomfortable. They're not easy to have. But at the same time, I do also want to share that discomfort is not the same as a lack of safety, and we hope and strive as we occupy the space, that we are both brave and safe. With that out of the way, I think okay for us, Yash, if we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, a quick session outline. We'll be talking a little bit about why it's important to talk about sexual and gender based violence at work, why it's important to use certain frameworks to think about it in general. I'll give you a little bit of a background to the book itself. We'll be reading some from it. Particularly in the context of the workplace, because that is sort of the structure of the summit itself. That is what is most relevant to us in the moment. I'll be giving us some time to reflect, share any thoughts, ask questions, etc., and then we'll quickly close. Yeah. I think that's a little about the session. Next slide, please, Yash. Superb. So just a little bit of background to the book itself. I know that the name itself, Planting Dandelions, doesn't immediately signify a lot to us. But the reason why it's called Planting Dandelions is you will find that dandelions can thrive anywhere. They don't need planting. And they're able to thrive in bunches together with strength and resilience in whatever context you throw them in, right? And so that's kind of the approach that we want to take in our own work with survivors of sexual and gender based violence. I do also want to offer a quick trigger warning. We will not be making any explicit mentions to it, but throughout the session we will be talking about sexual and gender based violence. And so if that is a topic that is difficult for you, please feel free to disengage with this space and engage back as you are comfortable. With that out of the way, just a little bit more on why we wrote the book itself, right? It's important, I think, for us to recognize as we talk about building diverse, equitable, and inclusive spaces, to realize that more than 1 in 3 women have reported um, being subject to sexual violence or gender based violence of some sort. And which is not to say that only women go through gender based violence, right? Gender based violence is based on gender, and gender is not just two genders. And so, for us to build an understanding of the complex ways in which gender as a dynamic of social relationships, or gender as an axis of social relationships, affects the ways in which um, we engage with each other, and in the way that we show up to the world around us, or in the ways that we occupy the world around us, right? And particularly in the context of the workplace, where we talk a lot about showing up authentically and showing up as who we are, being central to the work of DEI. I think it's also important for us to realize that for so many of us being survivors of sexual and gender based violence, for us to show up at work in a way that is authentic and safe, most of all, it's important for our workplaces to be informed about what it means to hold safe spaces, to hold brave spaces, and to ensure that the spaces that are part of our workplace, be those through formal, informal settings, be those online or offline, are safe to access and are understanding of the ways in which trauma happens and the ways in which we respond to it, right? Which is what it means to be trauma informed. As we read the book, we'll also touch a little bit about what it means to be trauma informed, particularly in the workplace. And I will be taking us through some ways in which we can make our own workplaces a little bit more trauma informed, a little bit more easier to occupy as survivors of violence. And this is not just in terms of what we can do to actively address it, but also ways to prevent sexual violence at work, ways to make them safer to occupy even before violence has happened, not just as a reaction to after violence happens. And so some of those themes are what we will discuss in our readings, and are themes that I would encourage you to reflect on even as we move away from this session. Yeah. So that's a little bit of a background on the book itself. Yes, we can go on to the next slide, please. Yeah. This here is the cover of the book. I thought it might be an interesting visual to look at as we read the book. I will start my reading in about another minute. In the meantime, I will sort of, I will put in chat for all of you a link that you can access to buy your own copy of the book. It's really interesting and really exciting for us to share that this book is now available for purchase on Amazon Kindle. We'll be stocking up on physical copies soon as well, so do keep an eye out for that. But I'm just quickly going to paste in chat for all of us a link to access the book, buy it if it is interesting to you, and read a little bit more about where the book came from and where it hopes to take us. Yeah. With that, I think let us quickly start the reading. We'll start with a section on the meaning of trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care, or TIC, is an ecological approach to trauma interventions that is based on an understanding of the environmental factors that can influence well-being, and that the interventions must not only target but must not only target individuals but also their interpersonal and community systems. Thus, the focus of trauma informed care is not only on the individual but also on the context and the role of other stakeholders, including the community, um, that they play that can inhibit or foster trauma recovery. In its most basic sense, trauma informed care focuses on the question, what happened to you? And how has the experience affected you? Which is a significant shift from the traditional, what is wrong with you? TIC is a resilience and strengths based approach that seeks to normalize the impact of trauma on people and emphasizes the need to be mindful of people's past experiences of trauma. It also aims to increase awareness of and responses to the triggers of trauma, and it focuses on healing. Thus, this approach not only takes into account the impact of previous trauma but goes one step further to ask, who do you want to be? This opens up space for survivors to rework on themselves, their relationships, and networks, which may lead to post traumatic growth. The term trauma informed care or trauma informed approach are used interchangeably. A trauma informed care approach seeks to understand survivors as a whole. It recognizes that trauma due to sexual and gender based violence can affect survivors' sense of self, their perceptions of others, and their beliefs about the world. Any organization or stakeholder that adopts a trauma informed care approach in their work realizes the impact that trauma can have in terms of shaping behavior and in terms of accessing services like healthcare, legal support, or mental health support. Thus, this approach aims to facilitate change in policies, procedures, practices, and communication to prevent re traumatization and work towards minimizing potential barriers that survivors face that prevent them from accessing services. Following from this, we also have a few frameworks for individual support providers and organizations in general. A couple of these frameworks that we talk about are those employed by the Texas Muslim Women's Foundation. Um, there are frameworks like the SELF framework, which stands for Safety, Emotional Management, Loss, and Future, and a couple of other frameworks as well. These models and frameworks allow us as organizations and as stakeholders within organizations to become trauma informed or adapt a trauma lens in our practice. I will allow you to read through more of these frameworks in your own time, but in the meantime, I think helpful for us perhaps to discuss, particularly in the workplace context, what it means to effect change and what it means to build trauma informed workplaces. A bit perhaps on first understanding stakeholders. You may have noticed when you access a service provider that they are surrounded by and attached to a larger institutional ecosystem. For example, a bank branch has management, employees in different departments, and customers. Each branch may also have an employer's union representative who reports to a larger union body, which influences employees' engagement with the organization. Each branch is also managed by a larger corporation, which has decision makers and external stakeholders. The corporation in turn um, is governed by the Reserve Bank of India, which works closely with the government. Thus, what may seem like a singular service provider, right, like a bank, with its complex processes of work, forms a part of a larger ecosystem with multiple different players on the individual organizational and institutional levels. Let's learn a little bit more about these different actors. An institutional decision making authority is any body or individual who has the power to make governing decisions or public policy about an institution, which all organizations forming a part of the institution must abide by. These authorities may or may not be associated or further governed by a policy making authority based on what governing schedule they are a part of. These bodies are able to make governing decisions and perform crucial functions for the various industries that they work on. Organizational decision makers are any body or individual who have the authority to make governing decisions about an organization and lead its functioning in compliance with broader industry standards. An influencer, on the other hand, is any body or individual who has the power to influence decision making, strategy, or operations in an institution based on their position as high stakeholders. Internal publics, on the other hand, refer to any contractors, employees, volunteers, or other bodies which implement the decisions of institutional and organizational authorities and deliver services on ground. External publics, finally, refer to the clients or firms with whom a service provider does business or the end users of a service. These can be individuals or groups. For survivors of violence, being supported by family members, intimate partners, friends, colleagues, etc., some of whom may themselves be survivors, these support communities would form a part of external publics as well. For example, a survivor accompanied by a friend to access government services or as part of a scheme forms the external public of said government department. The dynamic of support by external publics is complicated when some services requires the presence of or consent of those who may have caused harm to begin with, such as husbands. We address this complication a little bit in our recommendation below. Finally, I will take us through some of the recommendations that we have made for workplaces in general. Again, I do want to share that these recommendations that have been made are not exhaustive and are not prescriptive, meaning that they can be adapted to individual contexts based on the needs of the survivors that we are working with and based on what is accessible, available, and feasible for us as service providers or as people working with survivors of violence, right? Um, let's move now towards understanding how we can create trauma informed workplaces as institutional decision makers, such as the Ministry of Labor and Employment, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, etc. It's useful to amend existing laws around sexual harassment at work and other grievances to increase focus on preventative action and reflection and rehabilitation based justice pathways with increased organizational responsibility in case of offense. Extend, extend potential against sexual violence to all genders with due care to address interplay of power, privilege, and the relational nature of gender. For organizational decision makers like C-suite executives, boards of directors, upper management, etc., it's important to communicate stances on and measures of gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI, and against violence clearly, both internally and externally. It's useful to monitor GESI-based outcomes during M&E processes, make hiring, appraisal, and skill development processes more diverse across levels, and strictly adhere to sexual harassment and other compliance requirements, including gender sensitivity training. For influencers like workers' unions or businesses and other influential communities, political leaders, etc., it's useful to push for cross sectoral partnerships to train HR professionals and counselors in trauma informed communication and psychological first aid. It's useful to participate in strategic litigation to make workplace sexual harassment laws and guidelines more trauma informed, survivor centric, and with increased organizational liability. For internal publics like employees, contractors, consultants, volunteers, interns, etc., it's useful to participate in all compliance and additional trainings offered about gendered violence at work. For external publics like survivors and their caregivers or accompanying support providers, it's useful to support survivors with reporting and pursuing legal action through POSH law and for internal mediation as needed. Explain the process to them. Work with them to prepare them for any potentially triggering conversations with internal committees, local committees, legal authorities, etc., and present them with all of their options. That's a bit from the book on trauma-informed care, and particularly trauma-informed care for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in the workplace. I hope that this reading and this conversation was helpful for you, useful for you, and triggered a few reflections and a few thoughts and ideas about how you can make your own workplace a bit more trauma informed, a bit more understanding of the needs of the people that you may be working with who may be survivors of violence. Anything that the reading brought up for you that may have struck a chord or may have given you some ideas, please feel free to share with us. All right. In the meantime, I think I would just take the time to start closing up the session and thank all of you really quickly. If we can go on to the next slide, please, Yash. Yeah. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just wanted to take a minute to thank everyone who has attended, who's been here with us as we discussed why this book came into being, what it contains, why this is an important conversation to have. I just wanted to say thank you for being with us, thank you for engaging, and I wanted to encourage the book. The link to the book is in chat. If you would like to explore the book a bit further or explore its contents, share it with people, please feel free to do so. I am also available to be reached out to after this session at karishma@onefuturecollective.org. You can also reach out to my organization, One Future Collective, on Instagram or over email at info@onefuturecollective.org. We hope that you will continue to stay engaged with us and continue to share thoughts and ideas about trauma-informed care, particularly in the workplace context, and its relevance for upholding the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically because it allows us to truly honor the diversity that we have with us at the workplace and truly understand and appreciate the unique needs that people bring to the workplace and how we can meet them, how we can sort of make sure that the workplace is safe, that the workplace is healthy, and the workplace is productive, useful, and just overall a place where people want to be rather than a place that capitalist structures force us to be in, which is unfortunately the truth. But just generally, how trauma-informed care makes a place easier to occupy, safer to occupy. And I do hope that this session left you with more than a few reflections on the theme of sexual violence, not just at work, but sexual violence in general, and how we can respond to it in trauma-informed ways. That's it from me. Thank you so much for engaging.